Hi, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Hey, Kiernan.
Ryan, this seat is taken because I'm literally sitting right next to you.
We are sitting so close together.
We have one microphone. I can smell the coffee and vape coming off of Ryan like you wouldn't believe.
It's a strawberry vape, though, so it must be. I'm kidding, Mom.
Ryan has come for a visit to Boston, not to see me, though.
Well, definitely to see you, but also to see my friend Phil's production of Madame Butterfly at the Boston Lyric, which opened on Thursday night and is playing for the rest of the month. So, folks should check it out. It was that Emerson Colonial Theater is beautiful.
Oh yeah, it's gorgeous. A lot of beautiful theaters up in Boston.
Yeah.
And you're such a Boston fan. I will say though, I think I did convince you. Took you to a natural wine bar last night. You looked pretty happy.
That place was really good. What was that called?
It's called Spoke.
Spoke in Somerville.
That's right. It's right near Davis Square. It's definitely a top recommendation. I believe it's even mentioned somewhere in the Boston Trilogy episodes.
Yeah, that's most definitely in my natural wine list. I approve.
And I after a few wines, Ryan and I went out and I took you to some of the secret Boston stops that are going to be in my travel guidebook that's coming out. And in fact, this week, I even got the cover mock-up, so it's really becoming real, Ryan.
Yeah, I can't wait till you can share the cover with folks. It's really exciting, and it was fun walking around the ferry path?
The ferry path?
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about. The bike path?
Yeah, but it's when the word ferry involved in it.
Well, I think you're thinking about the little village that artists have built called Elfland.
Elfland.
But I don't think ferry path.
Elves and fairies inhabit.
Oh, absolute enemies. Are you kidding? Mortal enemies, the elves versus the fairies. Well, Ryan, I'm thrilled to have you here. And also, I like that you say you came to visit me when in fact, I think you're just looking for a pull-out couch to stay on last night.
Boston hotel's price is
very pricey, very pricey. Yeah. Well, it's a super exciting episode too, because this is a guest I've been just after for a long time. She's a wonderful journalist at the Washington Post. Her name is Lillian Cunningham, and we've talked about her shows on her podcasts, journalism on this show before. It started years ago in the lead up to the 2016 election. She had a podcast called Presidential, which Ryan and I, of course, both big presidential history buffs. And she did one episode per president. And what I loved was she, instead of trying to pack an entire life, an entire biography into each episode, she would focus on just one aspect of that president, whether when they were in office or a part of their personality. And I just got so hooked on Presidential. And she traveled around a lot and, visited historic sites, and she makes some recommendations in our interview today. But the reason it's very timely that she's on with us is she's got a new 5-episode podcast series that spotlights national parks. One national park spotlighted in each episode. It is brilliantly put together. We talk about the ups and downs of trying to capture natural beauty in an audio format, because you can't show pictures of how gorgeous it is.
Yeah, well, you have to use your words.
Oh, and animal sounds. And there's sounds. A lot of animal sounds, yes.
We need more sounds on the podcast.
Oh, I forgot to mention we're recording on the beach in Gloucester here today. So we'll be talking to Lillian Cunningham in an interview later in this episode, and digging into some secret sites that she recommends related to presidential history. But then also, I have to say she fundamentally changes the way that I'm going to be planning future national park trips, because she unearths especially Native American stories that relate to the park. So I'll leave the rest of the interview, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm excited for this interview. I was a huge fan of Presidential, and I'm excited to maybe binge this series on my upcoming trip.
Now, Ryan, we also want to make sure that we acknowledge folks have really been writing in like crazy lately. We're only two men. I mean, we can't respond to absolutely everything, but we want to say thank you for the ratings and reviews that we're seeing coming in. It really helps the podcast. It also keeps us motivated and gives us ideas for what you want to hear.
Totally. So shout out to HGUER2, who just sent us a lovely 5-star review. on Apple Podcasts, loves listening to us. They think that we mess with each other, but we're good sports about it.
I mean, I'm not a good sport. I'm very bitter about everything you've ever said to me.
Folks should hear us off mic. So thank you for the review. Keep those reviews coming because they help folks discover the pod.
But I would just say for future reviewers, and we hope you're out there, feel free to bake some of your own knowledge in there and make some suggestions for the show. That's one of my favorite things. We appreciate 5 stars and that you're saying we're doing well, but we're always interested in what you all want to hear.
Definitely. And that's why we got a message on the old Instagram, OOO podcast.
Like, ooh, podcast.
From a listener, Kim Photobug, who wrote to say how much she enjoyed our episode on Richmond, which we recorded together.
That's right. It's like this harkens back. Plus, we literally were just listening to Richmond, north of Richmond. So it's very fitting.
Yeah. In fact, for our conservative listeners, we want to give you a quick 5-second bit of that song, get some Oliver Anthony into your life, and then we'll come right back and talk about Richmond.
Lord, it's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me, people like you.
I mean, if that doesn't inspire you to go to Richmond, where the rich men aren't, I don't know what else. They should actually do a tourism campaign off that song for Richmond, Virginia.
It is the biggest thing to happen to Richmond since Reconstruction.
Also, you said. You said for our conservative listeners, but I have to say the artist has been out there and he's been saying he's just as critical of the conservatives as the liberals. So, he's a man of the people, right down the middle.
Yeah, we're gonna get him on the pod to talk about Trump.
I would love to get him on the pod. It'd be fantastic. Something tells me he hasn't left his hometown too much.
Yeah.
Probably got to cut that.
So Kim says that we need to check out this little town that is just outside of Richmond called Ashland, which is the center of the universe. So,
God, it's amazing. If it's the center of the universe, it's amazing that, first of all, that we weren't taught that in the universities we've attended. But Ashland sounds very interesting. And in fact, this sounds like a great way to expand. We only had 3 nights in Richmond, I think. This sounds like if you had a week to explore the Richmond area.
North of Richmond.
You could get north of Richmond if you're a rich man. You could get to Ashland. And then even in today's interview, Lillian Cunningham, one of her recommendations is a presidential site. I'm not going to spoil it here, but it's obscure enough I had never heard of it. And it's just 45 minutes drive outside of Richmond.
Well, there you go. So thank you, Kim, for reaching out. Put Ashland on your list. It looks like a lovely downtown, a very really cool old town. They got a lot of trains, which we love. Thank you for reaching out. We'll link to the Ashland website in the show notes if folks want to learn more about it. But I think we've got a big interview today.
Absolutely. I would say it's time to take off.
Tell the cabin crew.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
Today I'm joined by Lillian Cunningham, creator and host of a bunch of Washington Post podcasts. My favorite and my introduction to Lillian was Presidential, which what year? Was that in 2015 you started that in the lead up to the 2016 election?
I kind of conceived of it in 2015, and then episodes started coming out beginning of 2016. Yeah.
That's right. Oh, of course, because you had to time it so that it ended right at the election.
Yes.
And then those were followed by Constitutional, Moonrise, which is about the space race, and now a stellar new 5-episode series all about the national parks, which makes it perfect for the Out of Office audience. And it's called Field Trip. So Lillian, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Out of Office.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Kiernan.
And while I want to talk mostly about Field Trip and national parks, because that's so travel focused, the presidential nerd in me can't resist starting with just a couple questions about that great series, which stands up and people should definitely go back and give a listen to.
Okay, great. I love talking that too. Yeah.
So my first question is, describe the concept of presidential and where it came from.
Sure. Well, around this time 8 years ago, which is crazy to say that it's been that long, but, it was the fall before the 2016 election year, I work in the Washington Post newsroom. There was starting to be discussion about how we were going to cover the upcoming election. And so I had this idea for a podcast. I didn't really know how to make podcasts, but I had an idea for a podcast where we would go back through all of presidential history. We'd start with George Washington, and we would do one episode on each president over the course of 2016. And it kind of timed out perfectly that there were as many weeks in 2016 leading up to Election Day as there were presidents. So the math was perfect. And I kind of went on this journey to interview historians, journalists, biographers, and sort of take an audience through presidential history one by one. And it culminated, kind of on election night in 2016. But yeah, I mean, it was a fantastic project for me personally. Like, I learned so much about presidential history doing it. And yeah, I mean, it's great to hear that you loved it. I think one of the fun things has been that it's kind of become this evergreen resource for people. The episodes are pretty timeless, so you can kind of go back at any point and, brush up on Millard Fillmore if you feel like you need a little more.
That really gets to my next question. I mean, one thing I loved about your approach was you didn't try to tell the full biography of every president. You really focused in on a single story or a single moment or something really memorable. But I do have to say, when you were looking down the list, and as a presidential history nerd buff myself, were you nervous when you're facing Benjamin Harrison's episode?
Oh, totally. I mean, I will say this was one of those instances in my life where I kind of went with my gut on something despite what other people were advising. And basically everyone I talked to said, like, oh my God, don't do an hour-long episode on Benjamin Harrison and an hour-long episode on Lincoln. Like, that's totally crazy. Like, spend a bunch of time on Lincoln and Roosevelt and like kind of skip over some of these other guys. But I felt like that was actually precisely the point of what I wanted to do, was like to give equal time to each figure so that, we actually had a chance to dive into some of these people in history that, at least for most of us in school and life, we tend not to hear about too much. But yeah, I mean, I was worried about some of those sort of Chester Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, John Tyler types, but I will say they ended up being some of my very favorite episodes because I just learned a ton. They each had a totally fascinating story of how they arrived at the presidency. And in some cases, I think actually also did, in important ways, shape the office and the country's history, even if we tend not to, focus on them too much in school.
I do think there's obviously tons of presidential sites that folks can visit. And my last question on presidential and relevant to a travel podcast is, we know the Monticellos, the Sagamore Hills, the presidential libraries. Were there any, maybe just one or two sites that you visited and explored that you would recommend a bit more off the beaten path for presidential history buffs?
Well, one of the places I went that I will admit I would not have gone if not for this podcast was John Tyler's home. And it's a tiny home off the beaten path. Well, I shouldn't say it's a tiny home, but it's a not very visited home. And it was memorable for me in part because there was this kind of interesting ghost story tied to it. And this, I saw it myself, this sort of like creepy image that appears on one of the walls inside the house. So that was a memorable trip that stuck with me. And, I was the only person there when I went.
And where's that located?
It's down in sort of southern Virginia.
All right. So, John, I'm seeing here it's called Sherwood Forest Plantation. Is that right?
Yes, that's it.
All right. Yes, I'm not familiar. All right. It'll go on the list. I love turning up at sites like that. One, because if you're the only person, you usually get as much information as you could possibly get, because you find these big personalities who have spent, the last few years digging so deep into John Tyler biographies. They're just so excited to tell you everything because you've turned up.
Yeah, totally.
And I do feel like that sort of those personalities that can come across in presidential when you're digging in with historians who have written biographies of obscure presidents, focusing in and giving voice to people who we may not find anywhere else except in this one place. That definitely ties to your approach to Field Trip. You took a lot of voices from park rangers, from activists, from locals near national parks, and unearthed wonderful stories. So why don't you give a bit of a summary about what Field Trip is and how you structured the show?
Sure. So Field Trip, you kind of ticked through some of the podcasts I've done since presidential, constitutional, Moonrise. I've kind of found, my calling, I guess, in making these sort of big podcasts on a topic that I sort of think of as part of like American mythology. Like it's stories that we all sort of know, things we kind of grow up with, things that feel like a big part of American identity. But where actually, it really feels important and useful in this present moment to kind of, and, I approach this from the perspective of a journalist to sort of like tease apart some of that history, make sense of it, look at what some of the blind spots are and what most of us know about these stories, and then also really look at kind of what's playing out today and how that history can help us like understand the present and future more clearly. So for me, the national parks were kind of a wonderful next step. I mean, I will say like I love the national parks. I had been to a ton of national parks before doing this podcast. It was a personal interest. But they are also, these sort of adored, cherished landscapes for so many people. But I don't think the average person understands a lot of both the history, but also what's playing out at some of these parks today. So, for example, with the podcast, what we did was we went to 5 different national parks where there's sort of big, urgent stories playing out. So we went to Yosemite, where wildfire is threatening the giant sequoias. We went to Glacier National Park, where there's kind of an inflection point happening right now in the relationship between the Park Service and the Blackfeet tribe that lives right next to the park and that used to be on the land that is now Glacier National Park. We went to the Everglades, where there's the biggest environmental restoration effort in history on the planet taking place right now. And then we went to White Sands, where there's been this great new discovery of fossils. And then we went to Gates of the Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle in Alaska, where there's a big controversy over a mine that might go in right next to the national park. So that's kind of a long way of saying that, my hope was to take these places that most of us sort of visit as travelers and through the lens of like a vacation, and really look at like, what does it tell us sort of about this country's history, its values, the ways that we're thinking about protecting these landscapes, to take a look at these sort of big stories playing out across them. And for all of these parks, look at like, how is the Park Service wrestling with how to confront those challenges? And sort of what can we as travelers and people who care about these places sort of do and understand to be part of that effort to protect them.
I have to say, when you announced this series coming up, I was very nervous because for two reasons. The first is it does seem like the national parks has become bigger in the popular imagination and have become much more popular in the I would say probably since 2009, which is when Ken Burns did the big national parks documentary.
Yeah.
And so there's just been lots of media about lots of different parks. And I was worried, one, what stories were still left untold. And two, just it seems to me like stories of the parks can beg for visuals. And so the idea of telling these through audio, it made me nervous. And, I'm happy to say, obviously, you're here on the show because I love your podcast. So I thought you bridged that gap beautifully. But I am curious to hear, did you have any nervousness on those two fronts about unearthing stories that no one else has found yet, and making it compelling in audio storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit on the heart of the two biggest challenges that felt like they stood before me. Yeah, I mean, obviously I've watched the Ken Burns documentary and think it's incredible, but I did kind of have in the back of my head, like, I don't want to or need to sort of remake that, right? Mm-hmm. So I did put a lot of effort into thinking about stories that aren't told as much, voices that we don't hear as much. I mean, every single episode of the podcast has Native voices as a prominent part of it, telling not just sort of the history of the land before it was a national park, but also just what their relationship is like today with that land and with the Park Service. So, I mean, thank you. I did really want to make sure that we made something that felt additive to kind of what's already out there. And yeah, on the second point about putting this in audio, absolutely. I mean, I think everyone first and foremost kind of associates stunning visuals with the parks, but I thought of it as like a really fun challenge, actually, to like figure out how people could experience these places in audio medium. And so, I mean, for each of these episodes, we spent at least a week reporting from that park. We're there most cases, before sunrise all the way through like after sunset, recording sounds of animals, recording, basically like an audio tapestry of each park. And so what we really wanted to do was make it so that as a listener, you sort of click on an episode and you both get sort of an incredible, informative story about the place, but also a real sense that like you're traveling to that place, even if you're listening to it from your living room. And so I hope we achieve that, like really making these episodes immersive and letting people sort of close their eyes and picture what it's like to be, north of the Arctic Circle or deep in the swamps and marshes of the Everglades.
Well, I do think the Everglades episode stands out for how many animal noises there are, right? And how frequently you're chatting with somebody and then you have to stop because there are two alligators that just happen to be coming by, tempted to eat your microphone. So I do think that's it does ensconce the full storytelling. To dive a little deeper into that Everglades episode, could you describe the scale of the change that humans have made in the Everglades? This was something I was unfamiliar with. I have visited the Everglades, and I obviously knew some of how they'd been kind of capped in, but the size of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers manipulations of that environment were totally new to me.
Yeah, I mean, I found the story so fascinating. when we think of the Everglades today, I think probably a lot of people think of Everglades National Park, but the Everglades actually really describes the ecosystem that historically took up, the whole southern half of the state of Florida. So basically from around Orlando down, all of that was sort of what they consider Everglades, a system of kind of slow moving water through marshes that basically filter the water as it moves out and down toward Florida Bay and off the coasts. Obviously, though, while that's an environment that's, wonderful for wildlife, and actually it would turn out, does a lot to sort of help the health of the larger ecosystem by filtering water and everything. It's not good for building condos and, homes, agriculture. And in the story of kind of the Everglades in the 20th century is really the story of the US government in the form of the Army Corps of Engineers coming in and deciding that they needed to drain as much of the Everglades as they could in order to make Florida a habitable place, and a place where industry and agriculture could thrive. And the thing was, they actually, on that front, were very effective, right? Like the population of Florida exploded over the 20th century. Development exploded because the Army Corps came in and pretty effectively drained more than half of the Everglades ecosystem. The problem is that had a lot of unintended consequences. I mean, not only did it reduce, the area that could be a habitat for wildlife by more than half, but it turns out, especially when you put climate change in the mix, that it really kind of destabilized the ecosystem of South Florida. It messed up and choked the water flow. It caused a lot of the massive algae blooms and fish die-off that Florida has seen over the past couple decades. So there has now been an effort, kind of ironically spearheaded again by the US government and the Army Corps of Engineers, to literally go in and undo a ton of the work that they did to try to bring back more of the sort of natural flow of the Everglades. Obviously, they can't undo it all because of how much development is there, but they have truly a multi-billion-dollar plan to take out culverts that they put in and take out canals that they built and all of it to sort of they've recognized nature maybe sort of knew what it was doing all along, and they inadvertently messed some of that up.
And do you have hope that the environment could recover? I mean, do you, having seen it firsthand, do you think that there is a chance, or is the pressures of humanity and climate change just too much for it to ever return to what it once was?
I mean, I think the thing that has stayed with me was something that an Autobahn scientist who I spent a lot of time with out there in Florida Bay, who's been there for decades, kind of chronicling some of these issues. What he said to me is that he doesn't really have hope that it will return to what it once was, but he does have hope that it could be better than it is now, and that they can find a way to make it still a productive and important functioning ecosystem. So I guess that's kind of what has stuck with me too, is fortunately there is a lot of work and money being put in toward kind of saving this environment, and I don't think it will look like what it once did, but hopefully all that effort will pay off.
And one theme you touched on there about the Everglades itself, and this is something we talk about on the show quite a lot, is, these borders that are drawn officially around national parks they're legislative, they're created by man, and they don't truly reflect the fact that each park is part of a much broader ecosystem. And so there are parks that encompass just massive amounts of land. Gates of the Arctic, one of the ones you visited, stands out for its scale. But we're often recommending, if you're trying to go to an area where it's over tourism, like Acadia is a good example of that, take advantage of the state park system that's around it, take advantage of the reservations that are around it, because the nature doesn't know about those boundaries. And your episode about White Sands, which was one of the parks I'm less familiar with, definitely drove that home, mostly because of where White Sands is located, which is basically in the middle of a military complex.
Yeah, it's essentially surrounded by White Sands Missile Range, which, if people have seen Oppenheimer this summer, they'll sort of know White Sands Missile Range as the place where the Trinity test of the atom bomb was done. And so the White Sands National Park is, truly kind of right next door, and it kind of sits as like a little pocket almost within this sprawling military base.
Or Asteroid City. Wes Anderson also brought us to military sites this summer. So give a sense of what is White Sands like. Your description reminded me a bit of another national park, Great Sand Dunes, where I did sand sled, which I also want you to detail.
Yes. So that is a popular thing to do in White Sands as well. So White Sands is located in southern New Mexico. And its name is pretty apt. I mean, these really are just like bright, sparkling white dunes. They're the largest gypsum sand dunes in the world. And gypsum is actually kind of like, it's used often as the basis for like plaster and chalk. So if you picture that kind of white powder, that starts to give you an idea of what these dunes look like. I mean, it's otherworldly. You can sort of walk out onto the dunes and without too much of a hike, get yourself to a point where, if you look in every direction, all you see is just kind of undulating, kind of white waves. It's really spectacular and unlike anywhere I had been before. It's also it's our second newest national park. It just became a national park a couple of years ago, though it has been a national monument since the 1920s. But it's still relatively low on the visitation list. So, I mean, for me, I felt like, for people who have especially sort of national parks bucket lists, like you have to get there. I mean, it's a really just strikingly unique landscape in this country.
And what is sand sledding?
So, I mean, it's basically, and you can get them at the gift shop there, or bring your own, but they rent, sort of red, like sledding saucers. And you literally, I mean, you park your car in some of the parking lots. There are only a few of them within this sort of dune system. And then you walk up to the top of a dune, any dune you can find, and you slide down it like it's, a snowy mountain. And I mean, the park, while it doesn't have a ton of visitors, basically everyone who's there, that's what they're doing. Obviously very popular for families and tons of little kids kind of squealing in delight and running up dunes and sliding down them. And it's actually a a little more harrowing than I anticipated. Like, you go
I found
pretty
it
fast, and
I found it incredibly hard to keep my balance. And I'm good at sledding.
Yeah.
I grew up in New England. I can sled. And you got to wax up the board. It's a very unique experience.
Yeah, it definitely did a bit of damage to our audio equipment, tumbling into the sand and getting sand all in our microphones and kits.
And a place I was completely unfamiliar with being able to visit. Apparently, once a year, you can actually visit the Trinity Site. So when can people visit, and what exactly happened there?
Yeah, so this is, the Trinity Site is on the Missile Range itself, so it's separate from the national park. But both once in the fall and once in the spring, they open the gates. Normally the public doesn't enter the Missile Range at all, but they open the gates to the Missile Range. People start lining up in their cars at like 3 and 4 in the morning. Thousands of people go to these open houses, which is what they call them, the Trinity Open House. And what you can do is basically just drive in to the spot on the Missile Range where the first atom bomb was tested. And there's not a whole lot to see. There's kind of a slight indented crater in the ground, and then there's a black obelisk that sort of commemorates that this was the place they first tested the atom bomb. And other than that, it's kind of just empty and eerie. I mean, you have people who go, and a lot of people bring like Geiger counters, and they walk around and, test radiation levels, and there's sort of information displays, but it's a sort of eerie, somber site. But that I think, there are a lot of people, I talked to a lot of people who are visiting, and the sort of reasons people go are all over the map. Some people are just really interested in atomic history, US history. There are some people there who are like conspiracy theorists. Some want to check things out for themselves. But I would guess that after Oppenheimer coming out this summer, the visitation is going to go up significantly. This fall, there's one coming up in October, and I would imagine they'll have a real jump in the number of people.
And you do mention that there's this green glass that remains at the site. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so it's called Trinitite. And essentially what happened was when they detonated the atom bomb, this is, I should say, the sand here is not like the white sand dunes of the national park. It's more of what you would sort of think of as desert, a kind of like dusty sort of orange. But they detonated the atom bomb, and when it exploded, because of the height from which they dropped it, it sucked up a ton of the sand kind of into the blast, and the plutonium and the other parts of the explosion basically combined with it to form a material that had never before existed on Earth, which they ended up calling Trinitite. But it sucked all this sand up, kind of transformed it, and then it rained it back down onto the desert there. And it looks almost like green beach glass, or like it's a crumblier, but it has kind of that green kind of glassy look. And originally what happened was that it almost, like, if you picture almost like an ice skating rink, like it did like a layer of this green trinitite all over the desert there. Pretty quickly, the government sort of bulldozed a bunch of it. They carted some of it off. They did tests. But now, even if you walk around there now, you kind of, as with beach glass, right, you can kind of like scan the ground and you'll see little bits of it that still kind of remain and are churned up in the dust there.
One of the pieces you talk about is even a place that is essentially desert is threatened by climate change. That, you know, as the water below the sands dries up and becomes dry sand, the dunes can actually sink below. That was a huge shock to me. And this same landscape that, you know, traditionally the military was dropping bombs on also holds some historical artifacts that could be really changing our understanding of the history of people in this space. So what exactly have they discovered there recently?
Yeah, so just within the past few years, they've come out with this like really incredible and kind of timeline adjusting discovery of human footprints. And these footprints kind of straddle both part of the land that is on the national park side and some of the land that's on the missile range next to it. But they've dated these footprints back to, you know, possibly as far back as about 24,000 years ago, which just kind of blows out of the water the previous scientific evidence and theories that existed for when humans lived in North America. The sort of current thinking before that was that humans didn't really live here until like the end of the Ice Age, as ice was melting and they could kind of get across, you know, say from like Russia, they could cross over because of the ice melt. They thought that's how people got in about, say, 14,000 years ago. So this presence of 24,000 potentially year-old footprints has really asked the scientific community to kind of reassess its concept of human existence here. And, you know, there's a lot more work that's still going on. They continue to be finding more footprints. There's one man, Dave Bustos, at White Sands National Park, who's kind of led the efforts. He discovered a lot of these footprints. He's really pushed for a lot of the dating and research that has happened to confirm the dates so far. And it's now kind of one of the big ticking clocks that White Sands National Park has is how to sort of properly capture and study these footprints, as you alluded to before, climate change sort of erodes some of them.
In the White Sands episode, you also tell a story about seeing an oryx, which is a African animal that was introduced to try to create a game hunting area. It's again one of these stories that just everywhere you look, the impact of man and, you know, plans of decades past come and go. You make great use of archival audio to show us, you know, how different places were spoken about when a lot of these changes were going on. And another kind of running theme that you have through the show is you really investigate Native American ties to each of the park communities, often speaking to members of those tribes who are trying to change things. The one in Glacier that I found very moving was talking about the reintroduction of buffalo to that ecosystem. So tell us about that story. You know, why did buffalo disappear, and what was it like to see them released for the first time back into it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a first thing to note is that, you know, all 63 national parks in this country sit on what was indigenous land. And so they all contain sacred sites to tribes. They all have, you know, a deep human history that predates their becoming a national park. And in many cases, you know, I think it's not a coincidence, right? Like they're the same, maybe not the same reasons, but, you know, you go to some of these stunning places like Glacier and you can see how the same, string of mountains that Native people would have considered sacred and wanted to call home in that area are also the places that when, white settlers arrived and got out there, they said, wow, those are spectacular mountains. There's something about just the stunning beauty of some of these places that I think makes clear why they have been important to so many people across, millennia. But in Glacier in particular, I mean, there's a really tough story there of the way that the Blackfeet and the Salish and Kootenai and some other tribes in that area were essentially, removed from the lands that would become Glacier National Park, sort of forced into signing some treaties that would turn over those lands. And a lot of that sort of land transfer, and in some cases massacres, happened around the same time that there was also a strong effort to eradicate the buffalo in the West, because buffalo were a primary food source for Native Americans, and they had a lot of cultural and spiritual symbolism for them. So there was, this really horrible push in the late 1800s and early 1900s to kill a ton of the buffalo. And the result is that for more than 100 years, since Glacier National Park has been a national park, there haven't been any buffalo in Glacier. But they've remained a really important cultural symbol for the Blackfeet tribe who live just next door to the park. And in the past several years, there's been this effort prompted by the Blackfeet to reintroduce buffalo, both to sort of their reservation lands, but also to the national park, and to create herds that are sort of free roaming on the landscape as buffalo used to be. And just this past June, a couple days before we published our podcast episode on Glacier, they actually did the very first release of buffalo into the wild. And they're kind of monitoring now and looking at their patterns. But for the first time, in more than a century, if you go to Glacier National Park, you could see wild buffalo. And it's, both a really interesting reintroduction to that ecosystem, but obviously also symbolically has really meant a lot for the Park Service and for the Blackfeet to be able to collaborate on an effort like that.
Yeah, I've driven the Going to the Sun Road and was very used to looking up and seeing mountain goats. The idea of seeing a buffalo there, that it's unthinkable to me. And I pray that the next time I get there, I will be able to experience that. It's a beautiful thought. And this speaks to something I love about the show, and that you really changed the way that I'm going to approach visiting national parks in the future is the Indigenous history, the question of Indigenous rights. You speak to people who are trying to create businesses that are tied to the national parks, and those who want to forage and hunt in these lands that were theirs historically. Super fascinating. And I just, we get a taste of that with the parks that you visit. And I just know that there must be endless more stories across all of these parks. And so that's something I will definitely be trying to research more thoroughly before I visit parks. And especially it sounds like that, there's quite a lot of movement among advocates for making this history more accessible, offering tours that speak about it, and that, you can take your national park ranger tour. Hopefully, those can become richer in this history as well. But you can also take a tour that is specifically about the Indigenous history.
Yeah. And I mean, a couple things I'll point out. One, for the first time ever, the director of the National Park Service is a Native American, Chuck Sams. And also, I mean, I think obviously it should go without saying, but such an important thing to, remember and realize is like, this isn't just history. Like this is, just about every national park has right next door to it, one, if not several, Indian reservations, because basically all of these parks have a history of having sort of pushed people off the land, and then creating sort of these communities next door to the national parks, where, people who are members of tribes live today. And so, you were saying earlier how it's always great to think kind of outside of the boundaries of the national parks when you're going somewhere. And I would say absolutely, for most people, I think it's totally enriching to be able to pair, a visit to a national park with visits to some of the reservations next door, where you can learn a lot of the sort of deeper history and stories of the landscape.
The final question I have is, I noticed when you wrapped up the show, you did call it the end of the season. And so I'm wondering, might there be a season 2 on Field Trip?
We are still figuring that out. There is a possibility that there will be. I think we tried to make a 5-episode series that felt sort of complete in and of itself. We put a lot of thought and care into sort of the mix of episodes and storylines. But that said, we went to 5 national parks of 63. So there are certainly more places, and all of them, have stories that I would love to be able to go off and report. So yeah, I think that door has been left open, and, I think part of what may influence the decision is just how valuable it feels like these episodes have been to the general public. Because obviously at the Post, we think about public service, right? And our journalism, and trying to provide things that help people understand the world better, be smarter, take an interest in it. And so I think, the fact that a lot of people have listened to this series, and have loved it, and have kind of like you have said that even if they knew a lot about the national parks, they learned something really new from it, I think has all kind of helped us feel like, yeah, maybe we should think about doing some more of these.
I hadn't thought about it before this, but I feel like you must be torn in many different directions, because Washington Post, of course, is democracy dies in darkness. But the national parks always advertises half the park is after dark. So you must feel very torn. Lillian, thank you so much. We'll, of course, link to the episodes and to the podcast generally, and some of the supplementary material that the Washington Post put out all around the series, all of which is useful and informative for those who are national park interested. So, Lillian, thank you so much for joining on Out of Office.
Oh, thanks so much.
And now it's time for the last stop.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
All right, Ryan. Well, thank you very much to Lillian Cunningham for joining us. There was a question, Ryan. I obviously we're both big fans of Field Trip. I didn't get to get into with her, but I did want to bring up how often she cries in the podcast. She's so moved by the stories and the sights and sound that she sees. I was curious, have you ever cried because of something being so naturally beautiful in front of you?
Well, I've cried many times on the podcast, but we usually cut that.
Yeah.
The weeping, it just doesn't. Yeah.
I feel that was originally going to be the theme song, just the two of us wailing away. I do think some of the stories she tells are so moving that I was interested to hear how she made the decision to keep those into the podcast. So for the next conversation.
Yeah, and I do hope she gets a second season because there's so many more parks and so many more stories to tell.
I have a strong feeling that she'll be able to get back out there again. But for now, Ryan, we are here in the last stop. This is the last segment of the show. That's why it's called the last stop, the final segment of the show. And it's your favorite segment. It's my favorite segment. It is popularly known as the People's segment. In fact, maybe we should hear just another little clip of Richmond, north of Richmond, in honor of the People's segment.
Lord, it's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me, people like you.
I could listen to that song all day.
Me too. It just speaks to something deep inside. Importantly, we come together as a community here in this moment. It's a quieter segment of the show because we share unto ourselves. And what we share, it could be anything. It could be a daydream. It could be a recollection. It could be a plan for something in the future. It could be a bit of whimsy. It could be something quite serious. It might be an article that we read or maybe even an article that we're writing. But Ryan, it does have to fit one criterion, and it is this: it must inspire the spirit of wanderlust within us, even during the workaday week. So, Ryan, I'm going to ask you, as I ask you every episode, do you have a last stop this week?
I do have a last stop this week. Actually, one of our listeners reached out over Instagram, Andres from Hagerstown, Maryland. So back from my old Eastern Shore.
That Eastern Shore episode, I feel somehow it just tapped into something. You Eastern Shores are very proud of Ocean City, Maryland.
Well, Andres actually found us through the Boston trilogy.
Oh, I like the sound of that, Andres.
But he reached out and said that I might be interested in this digital exhibit that the African American Museum in D.C. has.
Sure, the Smithsonian. We've talked about it many times.
An amazing museum, and they have a special digital exhibit on James Baldwin and his time living in France.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and it is very cool. You can see a lot of the stuff that he owned when he was there. You can read various things that he did when he was living in France, a lot of just essays about his work, etc. It's a really interesting exhibit. It makes me wish that they would actually put especially the stuff that they have in their collection, his passport and his notebooks, etc. I would love to see that actually displayed one time in real life. But love James Baldwin, and Andres mentioned that we had talked about James Baldwin on, I believe it was Chattanooga episode, because there was a James Baldwin art exhibit there. So we love James Baldwin. He's a deeply traveled man. He's a New Yorker. He's a European. He's all over the place, and he considered himself a transatlantic resident, and I like that. That's very modern,
Yeah, I feel that I'd be scared of. You got to have a life preserver if you're transatlantic.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Andres, for sending that. Link in the show notes. Love James Baldwin.
And the exhibition is solely an online exhibition.
It is a digital,
That's cool.
Folks can go click through. There's a lot to explore.
It's also kind of a hard museum to get a ticket to. So if you're in DC but you haven't made it, make sure you bring your laptop and you can have this exhibition at hand.
Exactly. You can explore Baldwin without even having to pester your congressperson for a ticket like I did.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Wow. That's good. Well, Maryland's very small, so it's not that many people knocking on that door.
I live in Brooklyn.
You're current.
Yeah. Kiernan, did you bring a last stop this week?
Of course I did, Ryan. Always very prepared for the last stop. So the family and I, I'm trying to build up some travel for the request to do a parenting with a travel while parenting episode. And so the family and I took a weekend trip, a long weekend trip to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and we visited a whole bunch of shore towns that I in New England that I really hadn't been exposed to. When I think of those in Massachusetts, I think of Gloucester, but there's a wonderful area in Massachusetts that bordering New Hampshire called Newburyport, Massachusetts. And as I was telling people I was considering going there, everyone said, you got to go to Plum Island. You got to go to Plum Island. Have you ever heard of Plum Island, Ren?
I don't think I have.
It's this little spit that is connected by a long bridge and it has wonderful beaches. And as it turned out, the Airbnb that I booked happened to be right on Plum Island and had its own private little beach area, and it was an amazing time. And so I'm going to do a future episode that's all about this area and Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which had awesome history and a wonderful, very fact-laden cruise all about the military history in the area. So that's something to look forward to in the coming weeks. But what I want to mention today is I want to praise a local small business that had what I think is the platonic ideal of New England fried seafood. Ooh. And it's called Bob Lobster. Bob Lobster, and the crew all wears t-shirts that say Bob Lob.
So it's like Bob's Burgers, but Bob's Lobster.
Bob Lobster, yeah. Right. And it was started in 2001 by a local lobsterman who just wanted a place to put out his fresh catch. And it has grown into this institution, but it's very small. And we actually tried to go to dinner one night, and it was so packed we couldn't even find a space in the parking lot. And so we made a point to go back the next day. And what it made me appreciate two things. The first is, I think some people think you can just fry any food and it's going to come out tasting the same. The difference with fresh seafood, it is so much better. And if the person really knows exactly how to fry and they're changing the oil out and they're using a timer, it can really be an elevated dining experience. So while this is like a picnic table sort of place, the food was just so extraordinary. If you find yourself out that way, it would be well worth a diversion to visit Bob Lobster.
Bob Lobster. I love fresh seafoods and I love fried seafood, so sounds up my alley.
Very perfect place. Maybe next time we could do the episode from there.
Yeah. Well, you know what we used to say when I was living in Vermont about New Hampshire?
No.
The best thing about New Hampshire is the view of Vermont.
Lord.
But I know I also lived in New Hampshire momentarily.
I'm going to disprove that when we go to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. You're gonna find lots of things to like about New Hampshire.
Well, I'm looking
the taxes are very good.
Well, that's our conservative listeners would appreciate that. What are we talking about next episode?
Oh, Ryan, we're packing a surprise, so we're not going to tell exactly what we're going to be doing, but we're going to be celebrating Out of Office's 5th anniversary.
5th anniversary. What is that? Is that the paper anniversary? Is that?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I'm not sure. Let me just quickly look it up here. Let's see. Anniversary gifts 5 years. For him, that is what I need.
It's wood.
Oh, it looks like it's wood.
Well, okay. I've always liked a gift of wood.
All right. Okay. Right. I feel more uncomfortable that you're saying that sitting next to me in person. We're going to have to figure out some wooden gifts to give to one another, more than just our performances on mic. But yeah, 5 years, I have to say, we're not going to do like a hokey look back episode, but I just have to say, Ryan, it's amazing to me that we have stuck to it, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, it was the pandemic years were an interesting time to start a travel podcast.
No, we started pre-pandemic.
We didn't know what was coming.
No, we didn't know how many years it would be. But there were times that I did question your stick-to-itiveness, Ryan. But you've really contributed.
I show up every other week,
and you read the script I put in front of you. All right. Well, do you think maybe we should just one little clip? We had such a great trip to Richmond last year. Let's just hear one more little clip of Richmond, north of Richmond.
Oliver, take it away.
I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay.
Well, until then, I'm Ryan Davis.
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
And this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
Lord knows they all.
This seat taken by a 5'3", 300.
I think Oliver Nancy's 6'4". He's got like a big beard.
That beard's got to add an extra few pounds.
You better wash that thing.